Thank you so much, Monty. It is an honor to introduce Michael Stone Richards, Professor of Liberal Studies at the College for Creative Studies and editor of the journal Detroit Research. His CV is not only a record of extreme scholarly achievement, it's very intimidating, but also a testament to a uniquely generous spirit and omnivorous collaboration that cannot be easily summarized. His recent essay, Care Comes in the Wake of Retreat, published last month in eFlux, captures some of his interests and ethos that drive his current work. The final lines of that essay might provide one way to frame the subject of his talk today, and I'm going to quote a little bit. Care can only arrive in the wake of retreat, that is, collapse, withdrawal, but also retracing, which offers possibilities of new, historically conditioned projections of hope, where hope is understood as a horizon of possibilities. Care has become the nexus of a pursuit for new or experimental forms of practice and politics, cognizant of mutuality, but also conflict. Today, Professor Stone Richards will talk about the summer of Detroit, 1967, when the fabric of care in the city was torn asunder. I imagine that his reflections today will offer us something new, a new horizon of possibility, a new form of practice, as we retrace our steps with care. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Chris, thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction. I would like to say that Chris and I are only recently becoming friends because my wife Addie and I, back in May, were at a conference at Pulitzer Foundation and University of Washington in St. Louis, where we met the Philadelphia-based artist David Hart, whose work I've long admired, and he said, "Oh, you're in Detroit. I've got this great friend who's just arriving to Detroit," and that friend was Chris Dingwall. After the usual back and forth, we managed to meet, and I've rarely had the pleasure of feeling that as we sat down at Chartreuse, one of my little places, you all know, I've really had the feeling that I've known someone for so long. We simply got straight into the ideas, and I think that his arrival, I wanted to introduce him to people at MOCAD because I think his arrival here with the research that he has is on African-American artists, designers, AfriCobra as well, is just absolutely amazing and will be an extraordinary asset to this community. So to you and your wife, welcome to Detroit, Chris, and thank you. Okay, papers. I would also like to thank you all for double thanks. Thank you for coming out tonight. I have some things I would like to explore with you, and this is the first public audience that I'm exploring this. Thank you also for your patience, because I think many of us thought that this was going to start at 6, as opposed to the doors open at 6 and at 7. So thank you very much, doubly for your patience. And thank you for my students from my critical theory class at CCS, who obviously are a glutton for punishment, because they had 3.5 hours with me earlier today, and I said I wanted to finish class half an hour early, and we didn't, and here they are again asking for more. I am going to start, my epigraph will be 2 short sections of video, and then I will begin the presentation proper. First epigraph comes from General Baker, the late General Baker of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. The essay of mine called Care Comes in the Wake of Retreat that Chris mentioned has a little chapter on the League of Revolutionary Black Workers within the context of an ethics and a politics of care. I would like to play 1 minute, 16 seconds, no more, from General Baker speaking about the rebellion, the Detroit riots or the rebellion of 1960, followed by a short item, maybe 2.5 minutes or so, from the oral history archive of the Detroit Historical Museum and Society, which I must say I think is the institution this year that has done more original research than any other. So first, General Baker.
Were influenced by this rebellion. And you know, that rebellion in Detroit was like most of the rebellions that took place in the 60s. They were basic rebellions against the police forces. They weren't like the stuff in 43 that were race riots, because here in Detroit we had integrated looting. You know, had blacks and whites looting together, mainly a battle against the police forces. You know, inside they were just sick and tired of the way you've been treated. When the Army came in town and held down the east side, and the National Guard and State Police held down the west side, and they imposed martial law. If you got sick, you couldn't go to the hospital. If you got hungry, you couldn't get no food. But if you had a badge from Chrysler, Ford, or General Motors, you could get through the police lines, the state police lines, the Army lines, and take your butt to work. The significance of that we surmise is that the only place in society that black people have any value is at the point of production. And that's what helped us turn our efforts towards organizing in the factory, because that's the only place we had any strength and any value, pretty much.
The second clip that I'm going to play is from an oral history interview with Anthony Firamonte. Anthony Firamonte was a very, very young police officer during the events of 1967. He then used a police version of the GI Bill to go to college, eventually earn a PhD, and become, as life would have it, a professor of race relations.
You know, and I said, what BS, you know, it was much more fun in the 10th precinct. And that's the true story, you know.
Can you explain a blind pig? What did that mean? Would you know the origin of the name?
Yeah. Oh, it started during Prohibition, because you couldn't get booze anywhere. So people, I don't know how the word started, blind pig, but that was the nickname they gave it in the Prohibition days. And this is what was happening with Detroit, which really kind of, it was the Baptist ministers, especially the black Baptist ministers. They were all tight with any administration that was, Kavanaugh, Cobo, who was the Italian mayor? Mariani. And what they would do, they would say, hey, you gotta stop these people from going drinking all night, and we're the church. And so they made sure all the bars closed at 2:30, liquor quit being served at 2 o'clock. So you got this element saying, this is it, come to church tomorrow. Then you got this element saying, I'm not ready to quit drinking, I want to have some fun. I always wondered what would happen if the city would have allowed bars to be open till 4 or 5. Las Vegas, of course, does, some other cities. And Florida allows, you buy a longer license, you can stay open till 4. But they did, the Baptists were strong. So you had this dichotomy. And so we were told to enforce the law, and that was the law. You couldn't do anything in that venue after 2:30 in the morning, and you had to be licensed. And now a blind pig, you could mostly to sell liquor. Then a step up, there was prostitutes, and you can go in a room and do whatever whatever you wanted the prostitute to do. Then there would be dice tables, and you would gamble. And you could do all that stuff in a blind pig. Anytime somebody took a cut of the money, it became illegal. And that gave us the right to break in to rescue the undercover officer that was inside the place.
Okay, let's start. The main thing that I would like you to retain from the passage from General Baker is that the riots or rebellion, uprising, whatever term you would like to use, of 1967 was not racial, was not a race riot. It was not like Tulsa in 1921. It was not like Detroit in 1943. As he said, looting was integrated looting. It was not a race riot. Towards the end of my talk, I will also say that when Martin Luther King happened to be visiting Paris in 1965, and I'm going to make a few allusions to a remarkable article by the great French avant-garde figure and filmmaker Guy Debord, who quoted Martin Luther King in an article that he wrote on the Watts riots of 1965, and then subsequently on 1967. He quotes Martin Luther King in August of 1965, saying, "These were not racial riots. Émeute is the word that he uses in French. These were not racial riots. These were class riots." Second, from Anthony Fioramonti, I would like us to retain the idea, to retain what I think is a historical fact, that the Baptist ministers, black and white, as he said, had great power, and there was a lot of pressure on the police to police certain neighborhoods. I would like to make that, to expand that a little bit by saying, but of course, he's not talking uniquely about black or white Baptist ministers. He is talking about the middle classes, both the black and the white middle classes, who exert an enormous amount of pressure upon the authorities to police certain neighborhoods. That is the main thing that I would like you to take out. Now, as I start this talk, as I was preparing this talk, an essay of the great, one of the greatest essayists in the American essay tradition, Elizabeth Hardwick. Her collected essays arrived just as I was preparing this talk last week. And in there, I read for the first time an essay from 1965 called After Watts that Elizabeth Hardwick wrote. And again, later in the talk, I'll make some comparisons with Guy Debord. What I want to try and do today, using a phrase, a sentence from Elizabeth Hardwick, is to try and get back some sense of the enigma of violence, the enigma of spontaneous violence. I would like to try and get back some sense of the utter bewilderment of people in Detroit in 1967. Today, a narrative has developed, and it is a narrative that I think virtually all of us in some degree have bought into, that 1967 was caused by race, was a race riot. And when you go to many of the exhibitions that we have right now, that is the narrative. This is a race riot. This was the result of white racism. No one in their right minds can deny the reality of racism as a permanent feature of American history, society, and culture. But that doesn't mean that everything was caused by racism. We are told, for instance, that there are underlying causes, and that these underlying causes are inequality of access to justice, inequality of access to education, to housing, and, of course, to education and treatment from the police. These are underlying causes. In the Great Kerner Report from 1968, 1 year after the riot, March 1st, 1968 to be precise, looked at the various riots across the United States from 65 onwards and tried to give a structural account. And one of the main things that came out of that account was indeed that historically, culturally, politically, racism was such a structural, systemic feature of American society that we can look at these underlying causes as the causes. The first thing that I would like to say is an underlying cause is not a cause. A cause, if this were a cause, then we would need to explain why it is that there are so many other instances where the exact same underlying causes prevail, but there are no riots, there are no rebellions, there are no uprisings, again, whatever term that you would like to use. The term underlying cause, in fact, is a synonym for something else, for context. Within the philosophy of history, and one of the greatest writers that we think as we have in the philosophy of history is the Cambridge intellectual historian Quentin Skinner, it has long been accepted that context may be a necessary precondition of a historical explanation, but it is not a sufficient condition. That is to say, many, many things can share the same context, but that alone is not sufficient to give us a historical explanation, still less a sense of cause. Because once we accept the idea of underlying cause, or underlying causes, we then have the problem of explaining, well, why are there so many examples that manifestly fulfill the same underlying causes, but nothing happens? And I'm going to quote a Detroit writer, Desiree Cooper, on this very point shortly. Also, what I think we miss when we buy into this narrative that has long emerged, that long become accepted. I arrived here 11 years ago, and I listened to an extraordinary series of conversations on WDET on the 40th anniversary. I still have them. They were published as 2 CDs. And listening to DET 11 years ago and on the 50th anniversary is quite an extraordinary shift. And what was at first tentative, an explanation 11 years ago to find a sense of causation, to find a sense of explanation, has now become set in stone. The rebellion, one is not allowed to call it a riot, the rebellion was about white racism. When we look at the material from the time, when we look at the history from the time, there is an extraordinary sense of bewilderment. No one was in a position to say this was the cause. The black community was divided in all kinds of ways that I'm going to touch on. The white community itself was absolutely estomaqué, as one says in French, shocked out of their mind. There was bewilderment everywhere. And when one says that Detroit was the model city, that is to say the model city for race relations, the last city in which this kind of momentous event should have taken place, I'm reminded in a slightly different context that the great French psychoanalyst Didier Anzieux, in the context of 1968 and the student protests, the student riots, the student uprising, because 68 is absolutely a kind of uprising, said, why should people be so surprised? And he gave an analogy. He said, part of the modern period begins with the French Revolution and the institution of terrorism as part of our modernity. That period between 1790 and 1792, the period known in history as the period of the terror. Well, he says that occurs right in the midst of the Enlightenment, right? That such violence, that such epoch-making violence should occur within the context of the Enlightenment, he says, should tell us there is absolutely no paradox. We should not be surprised that violence occurs where we think there should be the least chance of it occurring because we're all so rational. To this extent, I want to quote Elizabeth Hardwick, writing on Watts in 1965-66, where she wants to get a sense of the inexplicable in private action and the unmanageable in community explosion. Let me repeat that. The inexplicable in private action and the unmanageable in community explosion. And in order to try and translate that for you, what the sense of the enigma of spontaneous violence, as I call it, the burning down of one's own neighborhoods, or the almost psychotic events of the Algiers motel incident. I want to try and get a sense of the extraordinary strangeness of the spontaneous violence that everyone says they saw coming, and yet the curious thing was, when this happened, there was not a single professional revolutionary in the city when it happened, because they were all at a conference in Jersey, right? They weren't here. And I think the irony of that should not be lost. The inexplicable in private action and the unmanageable in community explosion. What am I proposing then? I'm proposing, this is a picture from the Kerner report of Detroit in Flame. And I'm not yet going to say what the source of this image is. I am your worst fear, I am your best fantasy. I want to propose that we may be better off thinking of how we might explain the triggering event at 12th of Claremont on Sunday, the 23rd of July. The triggering event, the invasion of the blind pig. There are certain factors there that I think have not been considered. And this is what I now want to explain my talk, the politics of pleasure. First, there are different conceptions of pleasure. There is the Protestant idea of pleasure, in a Protestant middle-class idea of deferred gratification. Marcuse, for example, has a post-surreal, Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, when he becomes a guru for the student movement, has a kind of post-surrealist inspired eros and libidinal politics, a politics of pleasure, and which are captured in certain of the great slogans from May 1968, such as, "Take your desires for reality," "Workers of all countries, enjoy, not unite." My favorite, "The prospect of finding pleasure tomorrow never compensates for today's boredom," right? There is an idea that pleasure, which is anti-bourgeois, anti-Protestant, anti-middle class, can be the driving force of a certain kind of refusal. That is, a politics of refusal. Laura Mulvey, one of the great, great theoreticians of film theory and feminist theory in the Lacanian mode in the 1970s, in her most famous essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, famously wrote that the aim of theory, of avant-garde theory at this stage in the 70s and subsequently, was the destruction of pleasure as a radical weapon. The destruction of pleasure as a radical weapon in the context of her analyses of the male gaze, scopophilia, the male gaze, and how that turns the woman into an object, into objectification of the female body in Hollywood narrative cinema. Pleasure is to be refused because pleasure is facile. We must not conflate pleasure with happiness. Of course, we have the Freudian reality principle in relation to the pleasure principle. If you give in too much to the pleasure principle, you become too neurotic, go far enough and you lose contact with reality, and then you become psychotic. Roland Barthes, in his Le plaisir du texte, the pleasure of the text, develops the notion of jouissance in 1973, where Barthes is concerned with the body in the instant of the body's engagement with experience and with others in a fragmentary way, with the way in which pleasure, certain intense forms of pleasure, the French word is jouissance, which Frederick Jameson thinks would best be translated as ecstasy, overflows systems, overflows conventions, overflows anything to do with the idea, indeed, of law. Indeed, any notion of pleasure, and this we find from in a religious context all the way through to psychoanalysis, any notion of pleasure must be linked to law, to the idea of law, to the idea of containment, and through containment, certain forms of marginalization of the bodies. Most dominantly, of course, in the heteronormative, straight, middle-class view. The refusal to be contained by leisure, free time, and consumption. Frederick Jameson, channeling Roland Barthes, says, "Who says pleasure, however, generally means sex," because that's what we want to control, right? That's what we want to control. Whoever says pleasure generally means sex. And then in a very succinct formulation, also drawing on Barthes, he says pleasure is finally the consent of life in the body. Pleasure is finally the consent of life in the body. Jacques Lacan, whose work I think is easily the most important that we have in this domain in his thinking on desire. And here I need to point out that though Laura Mulvey justly became famous for that extraordinary essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, which was written in a Lacanian mode, it was written in a very limited Lacanian mode, because far from the destruction of pleasure, Lacan gives us an alternative in his concept of desire, which is captured in the formulation "Ne cède pas ton désir, va au bout." Do not give up, do not pass on your desire, go all the way. And he uses this in his famous analysis of Antigone. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, pleasure is to do with anything to do with the organization and management of pleasure is inherently political, right? And much of our society, much of our processes of socialization are in fact forms of the containment of pleasure. If we're dealing with pleasure, as I'm going to argue tonight, then we are dealing with something that is not, strictly speaking, to do with the economic, okay? And it's not to do with politics in the ordinary sense. And again, when we look at the best writing, the best historical work, when we look at the historiography that tries to capture what I will insist on calling the bewilderment of 1967 on the parts of those people who experienced it, on the parts of those people who survived it, one of the things that begins to come out of this bewilderment and in the best writing is that we cannot make sense of this, either in an economic framework or indeed in the usual racial framework. Let me quote from one of the many sources that I have from A Social History of Racial Violence, Raymond Murphy and James Watson. Research findings from the riots of the 1960s indicate that these most obvious causes of unrest, the economic and the political factors, do not exhaust. No one is saying that they're irrelevant, but they do not exhaust our understanding of the motivations of rioters, nor do many of the findings make sense in a purely economic or discrimination framework. Data from Detroit and Los Angeles, for example, indicate that the most active participants in the riots in those cities were likely to be employed rather than unemployed. To this extent, then, we have to think about the symbolic. Not just the economic or the political, the symbolic, which is much more than the psychological. But I also would like to take this opportunity to point out the way in which the control of pleasure, the containment of pleasure, is actually part of our modernity. What do I mean by that? I mean that throughout our Western modernity, beginning in the early modern period, but certainly in Europe from the 17th century onwards, we see, for example, the containment of theater. We see not only the containment of theater, what in France is called les classes dangereuses, the dangerous classes, more than just the working classes, but a kind of organized criminal underclass. The world of queerness in marginal places that we find depicted in art such as Toulouse-Lautrec's. Many of the paintings of Toulouse-Lautrec that we today can see in museums were not meant to be seen in public because they depicted sort of marginal spaces in cafe culture where the friends of Toulouse-Lautrec would gather for sort of marginal types of experiences. And of course, if the theater was a big deal in Europe, prohibition on the theater, wherever Puritanism prevailed, you would automatically find prohibition on the theater, including in New England. But of course, the most obvious example, the most famous, profound examples, the consequences of which we're still living with today in this country, is prohibition, right? Prohibition, which became part of the Constitution with absolutely disastrous consequences. All of this emphasis on pleasure is actually part of the process of modernization. And one of the things that I would like to suggest is that any adequate account of the blind pig should be part of the social history of prohibition and the consequences of that. Because in the 1920s and 30s, both the black middle class and blue-collar people went to the same blind pigs in Detroit. From 1948 onwards, however, Hubert Locke, on the 1967 riots, book that he wrote contemporaneously and which was republished this year, documented from 1958 onwards, the black middle class started to be accepted into public venues in Detroit. And from that moment started a separation between the black middle class who no longer needed to go to the blind pigs, and the blue-collar people who continued to go to the blind pigs. General Baker, in another interview that you can find on YouTube, points out something very simple. The blind pig was a social institution. In Detroit, and Anthony Fioramonti alludes to this, there was a license law that said you cannot stay open after 2:30 in the morning. If you are a shift worker, General Baker points out, and you're coming home at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're not going to go home. You don't go straight from shift to home. And the blind pig was a kind of intermediate space between work and home. And it was an intermediate space that was very, very well established, with all of the conventions that go along with these places, like police raids, yes, paying off the police, yes, but it was a game that one played. And it was one of the ways in which containment of pleasure was practiced. But what Fioramonti's comment that I want to bring up again does is to tell us something important, that the police were not simply acting because it was the law, they were acting because they were under pressure. And they were under pressure both from a black and a white middle class. This is absolutely essential. There is a long and well-researched history of the way in which the black middle class polices its blue-collar community. A book that came out recently by Rashad Shabazz called Spatializing Blackness is devoted entirely to the way in which the black middle class with the white middle class policed the South Side of Chicago as a way of managing African Americans recently arrived from the South of the United States. But let me give you some examples. There's a famous article by Hazel Carby, who teaches at Yale, on policing the black woman's body. Marlon Riggs, the black queer filmmaker, whose most famous work is Tongues Untied from 1989, that addresses the homophobia within the black community. Black Lives Matter, which in the press, one of the things that is missed, I think, in the mainstream media about Black Lives Matter is its queer dimension. It's female, queer, and intersectional. One thinks of the response to the blaxploitation movies from the 1970s, and probably the most urgent thing right now, the war on drugs. There's an enormous amount of literature coming out by black scholars And I want to give just one example because I think it's a very accessible one. James Foreman, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America, that came out earlier this summer, and looks at the ways in which the black middle-class community was absolutely supportive of the war on drugs. Indeed, they are partly responsible for initiating the war on drugs. Of course, by the time that they would recognize the consequences of this, it would be far too late. But this is part of a larger pattern of the policing of one's own community. Now, coming back to the question of the symbolic. My first thesis is that, oh wait, my wrong one. This one I need to keep. My first thesis is that the attack on the blind pig is attack on a site of marginal pleasure. I want to talk about pleasure now in three ways. One, the attack on the site of marginal pleasure. Two, that when the riot begins, the extraordinary sense of joy, elation, and intense pleasure that the rioters feel. And then lastly, a perverse version of that. Sidney Fine, in his authoritative book on the violence from '67, called Violence in the Model City, writes the following: the precipitating incident in the Detroit riot of 1967, and I want you to listen out for the name of Errol Miller. The precipitating incident of the Detroit riot of 1967 was a police raid on a blind pig that began in an entirely routine manner. Blind pigs, after-hours drinking establishments, had served middle-class blacks in Detroit when they were effectively barred from downtown restaurants and bars until things changed after 1948. After which, blind pigs became, says Hubert Locke, the haunts of off-duty prostitutes, pimps, narcotics peddlers, and out-of-towners looking for a little action. This may indeed have been the view of middle-class blacks, writes Sidney Fine, but it is doubtful that ghetto blacks saw blind pigs as dens of iniquity. When Errol Miller of the Justice Department visited Detroit in April 1967, he discovered that police raids on blind pigs were, quote, one of the chief sources of complaints among blacks with whom he discussed race relations. He concluded that the blind pigs were, quote, an important part of life in Detroit ghetto, and that police raids in them were an unwise attempt by a white middle class to foist its morals on the lower class, unquote. A police raid on a blind pig, thus, might very well have been seen by some ghetto blacks not as a simple problem of law enforcement, but as an event with both racial and symbolic significance. And it's the symbolic significance that I am concerned with. Why did it start in 12th and Claremont? Why did this attack on this marginal site of pleasure? Because 12th and Claremont had undergone an absolutely extraordinary demographic change. In terms of demography in the blink of an eye, from 1950 to 1957, 12th and Claremont was originally a white middle-class neighborhood, which started to then became a black middle-class neighborhood, a very solid one. However, with the destruction of Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, that traffic started to move over to 12th and Claremont. And when that happened, we had this significant demographic change. And I want to quote a brief passage from the African-American sociologist George Henderson, writing in 1964 in the journal Phylon, a journal started by W.B. Du Bois, by the way. During the period between 1950 and 57, the northwest section of Detroit was the scene of a large exodus of white residents, concurrent with a larger influx of Negro immigrants. Sociologists call this phenomenon an ecological invasion. There is, however, another invasion which appears to have more social ramifications than the former one. This invasion, 1958 to the present, that is when he's writing in 1964, is being spearheaded by a Lower East Side Negro residents who have been displaced by city and state urban renewal activities, or who are moving in anticipation of such displacement. Only a few social analysts have been able to distinguish between the two types of invasions, and more importantly, only a few are cognizant of the latent elements of social disorganization which may be inherent in the latter form of invasion. The social forms of disorganization. Let me give you an example. That where within a square mile of Detroit, within a square mile, typically 11,000 people lived. In that area of 12th and Claremont, it would be over 20,000 people. Homes that were designed for 2 families became buildings for 8 families. There was an extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary density of population in the process of social disorganization, as George Henderson said. That was a tinderbox, because of course that was now conflict between the existing black middle class and the newly arrived blue-collar community, and by the way, that is not to imply that blue-collar community are criminal, not at all, but this is where the pimps, prostitutes, narcotic peddlers, numbers runners, this is where they went. And the tension was between the existing black middle class and its own black, newly arrived blue-collar community. The police were the vehicle of that. That is the argument that I'm making. The police were the vehicle. This is not to exempt the police from racist attitudes, but it's to say, if we look at this structurally, the police were the vehicle of both a white and a black middle class seeking to clean up, quote unquote, its neighborhood. So that when the police arrive, several factors are at play. So the police arrive on a Sunday morning. By the way, Sunday mornings, it turns out, is right across this country the safest time in this country. According to one of the police commissioners, if you're going to start a revolution in America, you should start it in the early hours of Sunday morning, because it is understood that this is such a safe time that there are very few police officers available, right? So when a group of police officers raided the Blind Pig at 12th and Claremont, 9125 12th and Claremont, first, they were absolutely astonished by the number of people. Normally, in this kind of situation, they would expect to find, this is the Blind Pig in question, the Economy Printing, the owner William Scott, and this is the only photograph of the interior that I've been able to find, and I think that the absence of photographs of the interior is itself something significant. So normally, you find between 20 and 40 people in these kinds of scenarios. And the police officers were astonished that there were 80 people. And equally astonishing, they were divided equally, 40 men and 40 women. I have looked in vain for over a year, and I cannot find any substantial writing on that fact alone. Who were the women that were there? We know that there were 2 Vietnam vets, one returning to Detroit, the other about to leave for duty. So clearly, these vets and their friends were there to celebrate, but we do not know who these women were. We know absolutely nothing about them. And for a moment, the police hesitated whether to arrest or not, but they made the fatal decision to arrest. And they didn't have the staff or the equipment. So they started something for which they were not properly equipped. But even then, by the way, when people were being arrested, there was a crowd outside, and the crowd were not, in fact, the crowd were laughing. The crowd were having a good time. You can imagine, you got caught tonight. What are you going to tell your wife when she has to bail you out? You can imagine the type of conversation. All of the literature confirms the initial reaction is not threatening, it's not violent. It is only, however, when certain women start to be mistreated by the police officers that the riot starts. That we can agree on. And then it spreads out of control, and it spreads quickly, because the police, in fact, are not prepared, do not have the manpower. Let me read from Sidney Fine, a remarkable paragraph on the experience of the rioters. So we have the attack on this marginal site of pleasure. We see certain people, women, being abused, treated roughly, and that is the trigger. And then, for the next 3-4 hours, it begins to grow. But it's still within the 12th and Claremont region. But by the morning, all of that had changed. Sidney Fine writes, and here we're no longer talking about economic conditions, we're talking about the symbolic dimension. The initial hours of the riot, after the police first pulled out and then did almost nothing to restrain law-breaking when they returned, were, and these are all quotations from people who participated in the riots, were just like a holiday, a young black male told a New York Times reporter. Quote, all the kids wandered around saying, real amazed, like, the fuzz is scared, they ain't going to do nothing. In the words of the Kerner Commission, quote, an epidemic of excitement. An epidemic of excitement swept over persons on the street. Quote, a carnivalesque atmosphere of this sort was a characteristic phenomenon at this stage of the 1960s riots, constituting, quote, a giddy sense of release from the oppression of routine, white-dominated life in the ghettos, unquote. A relatively danger-free opportunity for ghetto residents to, quote, exact revenge against those whom they believed had for so long mistreated them. Joyce Carol Oates, in her novel Them, writes, the very pavement shook with the energy of their enchantment, unquote. When the Reverend Robert Potts, an Episcopal priest at Grace Episcopal Church in the 12th Street area, went out into the streets to see if he could calm the situation, he found, quote, a gleefulness in throwing stuff and getting stuff out of the buildings. Quote, I really enjoyed myself, a young black remarked about his riot activities that morning. This is the experience of joy, of elation, of intense pleasure that the rioters report, the participants in the riot report. But the phrase that I find most pregnant, most revealing, is the phrase that they felt a sense of release from oppression and routine, the oppression of routine. Not from economic oppression, but from the oppression of routine and the domination of living under white middle-class neighborhood, and I'm going to suggest also black neighborhood. What type of oppression are we dealing with? I want to make an analogy. I want to say that the oppression that we should be thinking about, if it is not economic, if it is not political, that is to say, the causes, it is indeed oppression. These are all fires from Detroit, from LA. I'll have a little bit at the end to say about the significance of the iconography of the fire. Gutted buildings in Detroit. This is a police depot where material that has been looted has been stored. a store in the process of being looted. A photograph from Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, talking about stuff and the significance of stuff, the significance of abundance. And I want to touch on this very, very briefly before I go into what kind of oppression are we talking about. Because Debord in 1966, in 66 and 67, that is to say after the Watts riot, then after the Detroit riot, gives an analysis that says this has nothing to do with scarcity. This is to do with abundance. This is to do with the commodity. This is to do with the alienation from the commodity. I was given an analogy recently. You know that psychologists and sociologists are now studying the phenomenon of depression that comes from spending too much time on Facebook, right? And how people go on Facebook and they see everyone else's perfect life and most perfect baby pictures and perfect weddings and perfect everything, which only confirms to the people who are looking at all of this how miserable my life is, right? I would say that if Guy Debord were alive today, he would be writing about Facebook. He would have to write about Facebook because the commodity is what tells us how miserable our life is. Because of course, no matter how much one has in commodities, one's desire can never be satisfied. And so, what is the oppression? The oppression is not economic, because abundance is not to do with the economic in that sense. I'm your worst fear, I am your best fantasy. This is a photograph called The Gay Deceiver from 1939 by the great photographer Ouija. I'm sure most of you know his most famous work, the collection of crime photographs of New York called The Naked City. And this is a transvestite being arrested, and I must say, not in any way giving in or giving up. And I want to make a connection between the treatment of queers, transvestites, and the type of violence that we see in the Algiers motel incident, of which this is the photograph of the house and the floor plan. And the three young men who were murdered by the police, Carl Cooper, Aubrey Bollard, and Fred Temple. I want to say that it would be useful for us to think about the gay liberation movement. I want to say that it would be useful for us to think in particular about Stonewall, because what is interesting is that Stonewall, when Stonewall happens and becomes the traditional birth of the gay liberation movement, they are referring to the black liberation movement. They are referring to the Black Power movement. And I want to suggest that we should be looking at them as well. Because the oppression, here is this newspaper headline, Homo Nest raided. This is in June 28th for 4 days till 1st of July. Homo Nest raided, queen bees are stinging mad, which is a pretty good headline. And here are photographs of rioters and policemen over the 4 days of the riot. Most of these riots last for 5 days. This one was for 4 days. Stonewall means fight back, smash gay oppression. And there was another extraordinary riot that people have started to talk about more in 1966 at the Compton cafeteria in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. And the Compton cafeteria was a cafeteria for transvestites. And just as with Stonewall, by the way, all of these places, they have very well worked out traditions, conventions, how the police behave, what you're supposed to do, how you pay off people. By the way, Stonewall, not everyone knows, not enough people know, was actually owned by the mafia, right? It was owned by the Italian mafia. And actually, the Italian mafia came to the support of its gay members. Why? because they thought the police were breaking the contract, right? They said, look, we've paid you. We've done our part of the deal. What are you doing? And they came to their assistance. Everyone knows how they're supposed to behave in Stonewall. And at the Compton cafeteria in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, in each case, suddenly, when the police came in to do their thing, they said no. Right? In each case. What I'm suggesting, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot use race to explain all of this, but we can look at the interaction of power and pleasure in certain instances where the attack upon a particular site of pleasure, a particular form or practice of pleasure, goes to the identity of the community in question. So when in Stonewall, these quotes are taken from the PBS documentary Stonewall Uprising from 2011. And these are all spoken with, there's one spoken by a police officer who was still alive in 2011, but otherwise all participants. Gay bars were the social center of gay life. In exactly the way in which General Baker says, the Blind Pig was an established social institution that allowed people a certain space between the factory and home. In Stonewall Uprising, a psychologist from the 1950s intones the following. 2 out of 3 Americans look upon, I cannot do the 1950s voice, 2 out of 3 Americans look upon homosexuals with disgust, discomfort, or fear. I am not quoting this psychologist approvingly, but it is important that we do not avoid the fact that certain forms of pleasure disgust us. That is part of the equation. The homosexual, bitterly aware of his rejection, responds by going underground. They frequent their own clubs and bars and coffee houses. They have their own social institutions where they can escape the disapproving eye of the society that they call straight. A police officer comments, "We told this to our men, don't fire. Don't fire until I fire. And you knew," and he continues, "because you knew that the first shot that was fired meant all the shots would be fired." I'm going to take that up in the context of mimetic behavior. But here is the quote that I found most resonant. The police, and by the way, Stonewall was not just for queers, it was transvestite and particularly lower class transvestites as well. That is also important. The police weren't letting us dance. If there's one place in the world where you can dance and feel yourself fully as a person, and that's threatened with being taken away, those words are fighting words. And the man who spoke these words describes himself as a street kid who had nothing to lose. And the police officer whom I quoted above said, "You knew they broke the law, but what kind of law was that?" I want to give one other example of where the attack in question is an attack on manifestations of pleasure, on practices of pleasure. And it's 1943. In Detroit, we had a race riot. But in LA, they had the Zoot Suit riots, right? The Zoot Suit riots, where just for wearing a zoot suit, you could be arrested. Just for wearing a zoot suit, you risked being beaten up. I quote one historian, "By wearing zoot suits in the context of the 1940s, when everything around you told you, you're not one of us, you're not American, and because you're not American, because you're not white, you're supposed to remain in your neighborhoods. You're supposed to remain in your neighborhoods. You can't go to our clubs. You can't go to our restaurants. You can't go to our movies, and on and on and on. In other words, we cannot share pleasure. We cannot share sights of pleasure, but neither do we want to see your pleasure. Indeed, the Zoot Suit riots were riots between American sailors. Some 50,000 sailors were passing through LA at this time. And in order to go to the clubs that they wanted to go to, they had to pass through Latino territory, right? And the tension was building until thousands of people came, thousands of Caucasians came to the assistance of the sailors, right? And the only way that it could be kept under control, went on for 5 days, the only way it could be kept under control was when the authorities stopped the sailors from leaving their barracks. Thereafter, a law was passed, an ordinance was passed, banning the wearing of zoot suits. And anyone caught wearing a zoot suit was stripped, and the zoot suit was burned. And you could get 30 days of imprisonment for wearing a zoot suit. So you're not one of us, but still, you can't have any pleasure not approved by us. So we will attack your expressions and sources of pleasure. Go away. What are we supposed to do then? Go away and just work. Go away and work. In the passage from General Baker that I used right at the beginning, towards the end, where General Baker is talking about the disturbances in Detroit, he said the following. He comments that during the '67 violence and imposition of martial law, workers with a badge from Chrysler, Ford, GM, quote, could get through the police lines, the state police lines, the army lines, and take your butt to work. The significance of that, we surmise, is that the only place in society that black people have any value is at the point of production. In other words, the workplace. So now, pleasure needs to be linked to the workplace. Pleasure needs to be linked to the factory, but each is a site of control. Each is a site of surveillance. Straightforward in the factory, but we're going to police you, surveil you also in your place of pleasure. That is the analogy that I see between the blind pig in Detroit and Stonewall in New York, the zoot suits also, and the zoot suits in LA, that we're trying to control in a system of surveillance. We're trying to control pleasure and, as it were, restrict you to work. So the oppression in question is not primarily economic oppression, but it's the foisting of a system of values predicated on controlling also the workspace. If there's pleasure attack upon a site of marginal pleasure, the extraordinary joy, elation, epidemic of excitement that the rioters felt in the experience of the riots, the sense of liberation, the attack on what Elizabeth Hardwick called the lowly symbols of capitalism, because they were, for the most part, the lowly symbols of capitalism. Who benefits? Who benefits from that? When we read the reports of the time, black middle-class merchants were absolutely bewildered. Why would Negroes, in the language of the period, do this to their own community? That was the question. The answer, I want to suggest, is partly because these were attacks on property. This was partly about the a violence between the unpropertied against the propertied. And very few of these people owned property. And property became a mark, a symbol of oppression. So whether it was white-owned property or black-owned property, it was a mark of oppression. And the act of liberation in question, the act of violence, the act of refusal, the act of rejection in question was a refusal of the kind of oppression that comes through property. That's why we had some of the most absurd stories that we can read in the looting. For instance, that someone loots a washing machine, takes it home, and his wife says, I don't want that, that's the wrong thing. So he goes back to get something else. Then when he comes home, he doesn't realize that he's a looter, by the way, but when does he realize that he's a looter? When he watches the news and evening news and sees a picture of himself. There are lots and lots of stories like that. Or somebody who steals a refrigerator, but they don't even have electricity in the home. Guy Debord's analysis that this is not about economic oppression, but it is about the relationship to commodity and the alienation from commodity and a system of commodification. That, as it were, in the moment of the riot, one is not even thinking. And why is one not thinking? Because one is part of a process that is fundamentally a mimetic process. And what mimetic behavior means here, partly, simply, I do something because someone else is doing it. But built into the idea of mimetic behaviors developed by René Girard are two crucial things. One, I want something because someone else has it. Two, what I really want is not the thing merely triggers it. What I want is whatever that represents for that person, i.e. their desire. And so what René Girard takes from this is desire is reciprocal. Desire is never something that comes from me, from within me. Desire is something that comes from the other. Indeed, René Girard says, to desire is to imitate others who are already imitating. And that, I would suggest, this acquisitive mechanism of reciprocal desire at work. I am doing this because others are doing it. And then I get home and I watch the evening news, and that is the moment at which I say, oh, that's me? Because I didn't know me in that process. So the desire, the attack upon sites of marginal pleasures, and then the pleasure in the refusal of the system that attacks, and then there's a moment when it all begins to go terribly wrong. I'm going to move very quickly through the following slides, but I want to make a few claims, a few suggestions. The murder in the Algiers motel incident, the murders, can be understood also within the framework of pleasure, but pleasure as a form of perversity. That is to say, where pleasure is the dimension of pleasure that is power is made naked. And I want to suggest that one of the things that happens in the Algiers motel incident is a number of people are caught up in an action that is a form of temporary psychosis, which is magnified intensely by the confined space. And I want to give some quick examples of the ways in which confined spaces and unequal power between participants can lead to perversity. I think the most obvious example is the Abu Ghraib from 2003. American soldiers with Iraqi prisoners, completely captive, who begin to abuse those soldiers physically, sexually. Here are some, on your left is one of the photographs of a man who looks as though he was led to believe he's going to be electrocuted. And I've put that next to a Robert Mapplethorpe photograph that used by my friend and colleague David Marriott in his book on black male sexuality. Marina Abramovich, one of her greatest performances is a work from 1974 called Rhythm O, where people are locked in a room from 8 o'clock in the evening till 2 o'clock in the morning. They sign a contract, everyone signs a contract, the room is locked, no one can leave, even if they wanted to. And she signs the contract saying that people can do to her whatever it is they want. She will not try to stop them. She will not object in the 6 hours. And we see a remarkable treatment of the body of Marina Abramovich, who is here, the woman in the middle. And here what I want to do is to emphasize the role of passivity. That as it were, when there is an unequal distribution of power, one is dominant and active and the other is passive. And it's in order to get out of that passivity, that's when a certain type of violence. And we see people, this is back to Abu Ghraib, a picture that became notorious of the shit boy. And I'm putting those two slides to get next to each other, partly to say there's a limited number of things that we can do when it comes to perversity. Very, very limited number of things. How we can cover the head, how we can make that erotic, how we can make that a symbol or a sign of powerlessness, the passivity of the body. The longer the performance goes, the more painful it becomes. Here is a woman who is wiping the tears. All of this, I'm saying, is a function of the confined space. There are 75 implements on a table that Marina Abramovich has laid out that people can use. One of those is a gun. Another is a bullet, right? Somebody could put the live bullet in the gun and put it in her hand and make her shoot herself. This is the point at which, in the performance, something remarkable happens, that the group splits into two. One group wanting to attack the body of Marina Abramovich, wanting, in fact, to make her pull the trigger on herself, and another group protecting Marina Abramovich. They didn't fight, just sitting there forming a defensive semicircle until 2 o'clock in the morning when the performance ended. And then something remarkable that happens. At 2 o'clock precise, when the performance is over, Marina Abramovich starts to walk out, and all of the people who had been attacking her ran away, right? Absolutely ran away. Because, of course, this is the moment in which whatever liminality, whatever bubble they were in, suddenly was broken, right? And they were back to reality. The separation, the space gives you a separation from reality that facilitates, magnifies perversity as a form of power. I'm sure that many of you have heard the great phrase from Jean-Paul Sartre, "Hell is other people," from his play, No Exit. Take a look at that play again. It takes place in one room. Hell is other people in one room. I am your worst fear, I am your best fantasy. Essentially, the argument here would be that in the context of the Hotel Algiers, 3 police officers dominated by one person in particular, called David Senac, is able to control the situation in such a way that using this, he himself is probably not part of a break in reality. My students this afternoon, I think, put together a really interesting argument that David Senac, the ringleader, the quarterbacker, as he's called in the report from the period, he's already a kind of sociopath. He's completely in charge. And the others are caught up in this absolute break, this psychotic break with the external world. And the confinement of the room serves to magnify the violence that they feel. Stonewall means fight back, smash gay oppression. I am your worst fear, I am your fantasy, is from a gay placard in 1974. And I want to use that to say, right across the spectrum, whenever there is attack on pleasure, when we're not dealing with the perverse form of pleasure as power, which is what we see in the psychotic instance of the Algiers motel, we're dealing with things that make us profoundly uncomfortable. Your worst fear and your best fantasy, because the line between what is fantasy and what is fear is never a clean one. And what we do in demonizing others is to set up a kind of system, set up a kind of law whereby we can be on the right side and others are on the wrong side. But in fact, all of this is a function of projection. I want to conclude with these two images. A detail from Diego Rivera's Detroit Industry murals from 32-33, and a photograph, in this instance, from the Watts riot of 65, Detroit riot of 67. Frederick Jameson, in a really, really interesting article on the politics of pleasure, talked about the way in which the factory, at a certain point in the early 20th century, for futurists, for communists like Diego Rivera and Stalinists as well, represented something that was almost sublime. Almost, right? Because this was going to be the mechanism for the building of the society of the future. This was going to be the mechanism for building utopia. And when James says that it's sublime, almost sublime, the sublime, as opposed to the beautiful, is that which cannot be easily represented, is that which cannot be easily managed. And I want to say, no, Jameson has a point, but no, because here the fire, this scene is from the foundry. And the foundry is where typically Black Americans were put to do the most dangerous work, right? This is the scene of the foundry, but the fire is contained. The fire is contained. In a way in which the fire here is not contained. The fire here is not contained. This is the sublime, I would like to suggest, because the sublime here means we don't have an explanation, because there is not one available. To have the explanation would be to suggest that we can give an adequate representation of what motivated, what created, and it would be better to look at it as a form of the sublime. Guy Debord, in a photograph that he published, and this is my final slide, in a photograph that he published in the International Situationist Journal in 1965, called, this is from the Watts riot, and he gives it the subtitle, Critique of Urbanism, right? Critique of modern American urbanism, critique of modern American systems of commodification. It's a critique of urbanism. James Baldwin wrote a great book called The Fire Next Time. The line comes from a Negro spiritual, that God sent Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time. Right? God sent a rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time. I want to suggest now that that is an economy of pleasure, an economy of the sublime, that no one is in control of, that leaves everyone involved bewildered. What we have lost in virtually all of the shows, the radio shows, etc., that I have listened to, that I've watched, what we have lost is the sense that everyone, black middle class, was absolutely bewildered, There was one person, a black radical called Lorenzo Freeman, who was part of the New Detroit Committee, a fascinating committee of upper-class people in Detroit who put together a committee to try and build a new Detroit. And what was interesting is how they tried to give greater representation to black radicals than to traditional black church people, black middle class. This was a cause of great resentment. Indeed, Henry Ford II said, the black middle class are as far removed from the ghetto as we are, right? And Lorenzo Freeman said to J.L. Hudson, what you're doing is really important, but you've made one mistake. It's an honest mistake, but you've made one mistake. None of the people at this table did anything to start these events. He called them the disenchanted and disillusioned youth. They are not represented at this table. And Sidney Fine takes from that was the moment it became clear how that the black community, in the context of '67, was every bit as divided as the white community. You would not know that from all of the exhibitions, all of the radio shows that we have listened to these past several months. It's as though there is one narrative to do with white racism, and that was it. No one was in a position to understand what happened. And that is why I think the model of pleasure, the politics of pleasure, and the sublime may give us a new way of thinking about this, as well as a certain intersectionality with a community whose whole practice has been self-consciously based upon a politics of pleasure, namely the gay and queer community, however surprising that might seem. Thank you very much for your patience.